Jim recruited Emery about, I guess, almost 24 years ago. I look at you two and you really don't look like you've changed much where I've aged. And so this question is about aging and the spring that is the muscle, and why my springs seem to not be as good anymore in terms of walking, whereas you guys seem to just be in perpetual motion. So what do you think changes in terms of muscle spring-like properties with aging that something like a stretch reflex does?
Connective tissue.
And how does the stretch reflex adapt to deal with the fact that the muscle changes its spring-like properties?
Right. So people, when they get to be of a certain age, actually, and Eddie, correct me if I'm wrong, but apparently people have more difficulty going downstairs and upstairs, even though their muscles were losing muscle mass, and we may be not as strong as we were some time ago. It's actually going downstairs, and this comes from Roger Anoka, who's an authority in the field. It turns out that these lovely little stretch receptors in muscles deteriorate. They actually begin to atrophy along with extrafusal muscle fibers. So you actually lose the capacities of these spinal pathways as well. And that's one of the problems why the spring in your step seems to, and then connective tissue.
So, Richard, I owe you a debt as well. I mean, you're the one who really got me interested in understanding the real basics of physiology as someone who came from primarily a rehabilitation background. So thank you so much for that. One of the things that I was struck by was, so in the rehabilitation literature, there does seem to be evidence that afferent activation through things like stimulation helps to augment the effects of training. And so I was struck by your evidence that during the downslope walking, there's more the spindle activity, which is primarily excitatory and has that direct connection to the motor neuron. And I was thinking, oh, well, that's why they have a larger training effect when they're walking downslope. But then you suggested that it was actually inhibition. So I wondered if you could resolve that apparent conflict.
Well, the thing is, it's not the fact of the fact that there is excitation and inhibition. It's a matter of how much. So it's the training of that proper balance of inhibition and excitation that is what results in the return toward the normal. So it's probably a reduction. So some muscles receive far too much inhibition, other muscles receive far too little after the injury. So it's actually renormalizing that to get to more of a balance. And by the way, your own PhD work was a prodigious exercise in basic science, if I might remind you, with Paul Stein. So I think it's not that you're trying to get to train more, you're trying to actually restore that proper balance between the two. If that answers the question, I'm not sure. Sorry. But.
Hey Richard, it's cool to see all your work in like one presentation. Puts a lot into context. And I guess that's sort of an existential question, which is a little broader.
Uh-oh.
I mean, since we're talking about understanding, I guess. So you showed this really, whether it's the single muscle where the stretch reflex, brings the springiness back, or whether it's in your cats where, if you've lost the reflexes, they're crouching, and if you train them, they get this back. So you've shown the effect of reflexes and what they do, but you've shown them these tasks which are pretty like steady state and unchanging, right? So the existential question is like, why in these sort of steady tasks like walk on flat ground or something where you know what's going to happen, you've done it for years and years and years, why does the body even depend on reflexes there? Like why can't you just control it differently? Like if you know you're crouching, why doesn't the cat just stimulate it more or something like that?
Sure. Okay, so that's a great question. So the question has to do with the fact that for these sort of repetitive actions, and we're trying to get more towards natural movements where you're just doing all kinds of things, but during these repetitive tasks, the brain's pretty smart, and why doesn't it anticipate all of these things? And we did an experiment accidentally once. We, because of a technique that, and I meant to make more of this before, a technique that Tim Cope introduced us to, which is also accidental on his part. That is, if you surgically cut a nerve to a muscle and repair it, the muscle ends up being perfectly normal, except it has no stretch reflex. And there's a whole story there with Travis here and Paul and Lena and a bunch of people have contributed to this. But we use those figures that I showed from Clotilde's work, where she showed how a muscle behaves with and without the reflex. Those were done using that technique. So one muscle was reinnervated, and so it didn't have a stretch reflex, and the other one was fully. And the thing is, we did those experiments in animals. We maybe did a one muscle group where we reinnervated the muscles, and it takes about 9 months to get the animal back into service again, where they can actually use those muscles again, because they have to regenerate into their muscle. That one animal in particular, we had him in the animal facility, uncaged, of course, for 4 years. And he never, ever learned how to correct his posture going downhill. He had this excessive yield because we had eliminated the stretch reflex during this down ramp walking. And it never recovered one iota. And I think the reason for that is because when a muscle, remember I said at the beginning that a muscle becomes activated, and whether it behaves as a motor or a spring has to do with how it's loaded. So in other words, it's the outside world that's determining the function of that muscle under those conditions. And the animal never ever learned to do some fancy compensation thing to avoid this excessive yielding. Now, of course, you can say, yeah, but what was the pressure for that animal to do that? I mean, the animals didn't fall over; they succeeded, and so that's a legitimate objection. However, many people told us these animals are going to look perfectly fine. They're going to adapt to this in a matter of a few months. You're never going to notice anything. And in fact, when they're walking on a level ground, you'd never notice anything was wrong with them. We took a whole study section, an investigation team over to the lab to demonstrate this phenomenon. They said, you're not going to see anything. We'd never actually done the experiment. We did it at the site visit. Put the animals on the ramp, put the food at the top of the ramp. The animals ran right up with no problem. Put the food at the bottom of the ramp, went down the ramp, and this big yield, even after 4 years. So anyway, that's my not quite completely satisfactory answer to your question.
Yeah.